Okay, I think we can start. My name's Simon Goldhill. I'm a professor at Cambridge and the Foreign Secretary of the British Academy. And I'm chairing this session on researchers at risk from Ukraine because I chair the Committee for Refugees, Researchers at Risk, which is run by the Royal Society, the British Academy, the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Academy of Medical Sciences, and I chair that on behalf of the British Academy. And so far, thanks to fundraising from the government and other sources, we've managed to bring out 180 researchers from Ukraine with 206 dependents attached. Amazingly, 71 different institutions in Britain have hosted refugees. It's about 73% women and about 27% men for obvious reasons to do with conscription laws. But it's been an absolutely wonderful opportunity. We've moved in various fields from post-quantum cybersecurity to Egyptology to gender studies to biotechnology. And it's been great to have various events in the Royal Society where we managed to bring, I think, 35 children to play for the first time in the Royal Society. It was a very wonderful sight, seeing baffled fellows. And it's been wonderful to see how people have been able to develop their skills, their education, their research, and their lives in this country. We've been talking so far about emergencies. I think we can all agree that there was one emergency that might be up front in our minds right now. I'm going to start by asking Luke to introduce the work that's been done by the European academies on behalf of the refugees, Ukrainian researchers at risk. Luke.
So thank you very much, Simon, for that introduction. What I want to talk about today is mainly based on the experience that ALIA and the International Science Council have had with two major conferences that we organized online. The first in June 2022 and the second this year in March. And the report from the first conference is available online. You can find it on the ALIA or the ISC website. The second report is finalized, but it has to be approved and copied and typeset and will be released in the next few weeks, I hope. There have also been very useful discussions at the Ukrainian Stakeholders Forum, which is an ad hoc group convened jointly by ISC and ALIA, which meets roughly once a month for 1 hour on Zoom to discuss programs, experiences, and exchange ideas. And of course, I should mention the very useful contributions from the UK and Irish Academy's Human Rights Committee, which I also sit on. And there have been various other interactions with Science for Ukraine, the MSCA for Ukraine program, etc. So let me start with a fairly fundamental question, which is why should the academies take a particular interest in the situation in Ukraine? And I think there are a number of answers. I mean, certainly one for me is a real sense of academic solidarity. We are a community united by common values, by a search for knowledge and understanding. And we do feel ourselves to be a global community. Certainly I do. And that means we have responsibilities to our colleagues. A more pragmatic reason, perhaps, is that science is a global endeavor. We are trying to create a global good of humanity, and a loss of research infrastructure and capability anywhere weakens that enterprise. And finally, more pragmatically perhaps, if you want to reconstruct after the crisis, as we've heard in the previous panels, then first of all, you do need a science base to help in building a modern economy. And I think an aspect which isn't emphasized enough perhaps, if you want an evidence-based reconstruction, then you need a research capability on the ground which can do economic, social science, etc. analyses to evaluate the programs and judge whether they really are working as intended to. Far too often we see helicopter initiatives dumped in from above without proper consultation with local expertise. So how did Europe respond? Well, I think one of the really impressive and, for me, quite heartwarming aspects of this terrible tragedy has been that there was an immediate outpouring in the academic community throughout Europe and abroad, and actually internationally, which found expressions in the Science for Ukraine grassroots movement, which I was involved with. And there were a very large number of ad hoc individual and institutional offers made in the first few weeks. But I think any of us involved with it became very rapidly clear that what you actually needed was state-level resources and coordination. So we moved very rapidly into a more lobbying mode where we were just trying to draw attention to the needs of the situation. And as Simon said, I mean, the initial focus clearly was on displaced academics who had fled Ukraine, and these were mainly women with young children. But it has to be said that understandably, if you're in that situation, your first priority is the safety of your children, and your career comes second. I think it was a credit to the research community and the research funding organizations that they all made efforts initially. But in many cases, of course, national and institutional policies were a problem. I mean, certainly speaking for Ireland, our funding agencies have this problem that, for good reasons, they run limited cycles of calls for proposals. These have to be peer-reviewed, etc. So it's very difficult to rapidly do something. What they could do and did was to say that existing programs, if the PIs could identify Ukrainian colleagues who could be taken on into their research teams, they would make special funds available to do that. And I think that was a model that was fairly widely adopted throughout Europe. But getting funds out of a national jurisdiction is always going to be a bit of a difficulty politically. And I think another lesson we learned was that the programs for displaced academics which were in place, some of which actually date back over 90 years. I mean, the Committee for At-Risk Academics, CARA, is 90 years old this year. Incidentally, the Irish, CARA is also the Irish word for friend, which is a nice coincidence, I think. But those, although they existed, I think they all found it very difficult to rapidly scale up to the demands of the situation precipitated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what could the academies do? I mean, let's be honest, we have rather limited resources. What we can do is leverage our connections to advocate for programs, but also we have a very valuable function as networking. So coordination and communication turned out to be very key factors in the evolving response. And I would particularly mention here Science for Ukraine, which in the early weeks was a vital resource for me anyway, in finding out what were the likely numbers of refugees, what were their needs, what was the lived experience of those. I mentioned the Ukraine Stakeholders Forum, convened jointly by the International Science Council and ALIA. Again, this turned out to be very important because it was a way of just exchanging information among various NGOs, organizations, academies, and bodies, which were all trying to do things but didn't know necessarily what everyone else was doing. So that was very useful. And I mentioned the 2 international conferences which we held. And one thing I'm very proud of is that we managed to get almost exactly half the participants from Ukraine or with Ukrainian nationality, and the rest international. So we had a genuine platform for Ukrainian voices, and that was, I think, greatly appreciated and was very important because, as I said, it is important to use local expertise. Again, a theme that has come through many times today is the importance of locality. And of course, complementing these bottom-up events, there have also been coordination meetings by the presidents of key academies, etc. Antonio has been involved, the president of the Royal Society, etc. So what has really impressed me, one thing that really has impressed me is the resilience and agency that the Ukrainian research system has shown. It has had an extraordinary ability to actually keep going despite everything. So 17 to 20% of the research infrastructure has been destroyed, 80% of the research funding is gone, and yet there is still a viable research community within Ukraine trying to keep working. And it is our responsibility, I think, to help them in any way we can. There was not the massive exodus of scholars and scientists that we initially feared. I would like particularly to mention here the very impressive, in terms of resilience and agency, have a look at the website scienceatrisk.org, which is as far as I can make out, a diaspora-organized Ukrainian website mainly hosted in America, which really is very impressive. So I think as we move into this current phase of the crisis, what we need to focus on actually is supporting researchers in Ukraine itself. And of course, a complicating factor here is that the Ukrainian research system was modeled largely on the old Soviet system and doesn't have the accountability and governance standards which we would expect in a modern research system. So reform of the research funding systems and infrastructures in Ukraine to better align them with European standards and expectations is vital. And I'm glad to say that this is clearly happening. And also there is a clear willingness on the part of European funders and agencies to assist with this. What did ALIA itself do? Well, very early on, ALIA managed to find funding from the Breakthrough Prize Foundation for a European Fund for Displaced Scientists, the EFDS, which was one of the first, if not, I think, the first initiative to actually have a funding line designed to support research in Ukraine itself. So there were two funding lines, one for displaced academics, the other for projects based in Ukrainian universities. And there were these. Stream 1 got 244 applications. Stream 2, which is the in Ukraine one, got 105 applications. I won't bother you with the detailed statistics, but in the end, I think focusing on support for research in Ukraine, which I think personally now must be our key priority, the EFDS was able to support 7 institutions and 98 researchers in Ukraine. There have been other initiatives. I would particularly like to praise the Polish Academy, which has been remarkable actually in the level of engagement and support it has offered to Ukraine. There are obvious historical and cultural reasons why this should be the case, but the fact that they did it is still worth praising. And they have a very interesting PI project currently supported by the US National Academy of Sciences, whereby they have a PI who has to be based in Poland, but he supports a team of early career researchers back in Ukraine. And this picks up on my point that we have to support researchers in Ukraine. There's an EU program, MSCA for Ukraine, which is coordinated by Scholars at Risk Europe and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. This is very similar to Scholars at Risk in that it supports essentially displaced academics. Very interestingly, there's a new International Center for Mathematics in Ukraine, supported by private funding from a firm I've never heard of called XTX Markets. I guess it's some sort of hedge fund. There's an interesting intertwining between pure mathematics and financial engineering at the moment, which would be a subject for another day's discussion. We have the British Academy's Researchers at Risk program, bilateral schemes by the Swiss, Dutch, and other funding agencies, and many university partnerships. And I think university partnerships are a very valuable tool, actually. So I do want to come back to this point that career continuity for early career researchers in Ukraine seems to me to be vital. If we want to maintain a functioning research system in Ukraine, then we have to support early career researchers who are at a particularly vulnerable stage in their career development. If we lose that generation, then that will have consequences for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years, because there will be a whole generation who have left the research system and won't come back. There is an understandable, but I personally think excessive anxiety in Ukraine itself about the risk of so-called brain drain. They are very worried that they will lose a cohort of people who will go abroad and won't come back. Personally, I think this is exaggerated. From my experience, almost all the refugees do in fact wish to return, and if they bring back international experience with them and help to reform the Ukrainian system, that can only be a good thing. So let me move on. I just want to finish up by making some, I think, quite interesting points about how this all interacts and intersects with other policy shifts that are going on in the global science system. I'm an advocate for open science. We had a reference to it earlier in the last session. And I think a point worth making is that open science is actually a boon for displaced academics. Your home institution may be bombed, your library may be destroyed, but if you have access to the internet, in principle, open science means you can still access the literature and even some of the data as long as you have the internet connection, which most of us have nowadays. Remote working and online meetings have been enormously valuable. This is something that's going to continue. Reforms in research assessment, the use of narrative CVs. Again, it's very helpful. It will allow people whose careers have been interrupted by the war on Ukraine to detail why exactly their career suffered this hiatus. So better than the traditional CV. And of course, the greater emphasis on diversity and inclusion is important because the marginalized groups who are usually most affected in any crisis are precisely these people. So that is my summary, and I'd like to hand it over back to the chairman. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Professor Drury. Professor Drury mentioned that building back is absolutely crucial, rebuilding the research structures in Ukraine. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce first to speak Professor Larysa Zasiekina, who's the Professor of Psychology at Larysa Ukrainica Volyn National University, currently based at Trinity College, Cambridge, around the corner from me, where she works in the Sarah Jane Blakemore's group, whom some of you will know. And Professor Zasiekina is a leading expert in PTSD, cultural aspects of memory of trauma, and her focus is on the psychological intergenerational impact of genocide in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, including studies of survivors of the Holocaust and other such events and their children. So with this clinical perspective and experience, it's going to be very important that your research is directly related to the possibility of rebuilding and what the consequences are going to be. And so it's a great pleasure indeed to invite Professor Zasiekina to address us.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. I'll try to be not so traumatic for you. And so Russia's full-scale invasion created a sense of continuous traumatic stress, and not only in Ukraine, but globally. And this invasion is the most significant one by one state against another in Europe since World War II. And the rapid deployment of many civilians with not appropriate training is a very large risk factor for post-traumatic stress disorder in military population and in civilian population. Repeated displacements since 2014, because we know that the first invasion of Russia was in 2014, and then many people from eastern parts of Ukraine moved into central parts of Ukraine, And then when this war started, the same people from the central parts of Ukraine had to move further in the western parts of Ukraine. And also rocket sirens and missiles are risk factors for post-traumatic stress disorder in civilian population. The Russia-Ukraine war is often called moral outrage and disruption of the general ethics of politics. Was the war merely unexpected? Yes, despite of the warnings of international community, we hardly believed that this detrimental war could be possible. The prerequisites of the war started long ago, but I would like to mention the time I lived in, the collapse of Soviet Union. And in the authoritative and provocative book, Armageddon Averted, by a very famous American historian Stephen Kotkin, he describes a high drama of Soviet Union, how superpower of Soviet Union fell apart while armed to the teeth with military troops and weapons. And actually, nobody believed and expected that Soviet Union fell apart from inside. Everybody accepted some external enemy. And Stephen Kotkin points out three main reasons for this collapse. The first is the personality of Gorbachev and his radical ideas and his radical character. The second is economic weakness. But the last reason, I think, is the most important in the context of this war of Ukraine. And this reason is the full underestimation of the national identity of the Soviet republics. Therefore, Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian culture have never been fully recognized and adequately estimated by Russians. More to the point, the Ukrainian identity has been heavily suppressed. It has produced epistemic injustice about Ukraine and the Ukrainians in the world. Therefore, I am happy to have an opportunity to overcome this epistemic injustice and give the Ukraine a voice and make a difference in understanding Ukraine as an authentic state with glorious nation, which is quite separate from Russian empire, Russian language and Russian culture. In my research, the epistemic injustice of Ukraine is expressed through psychological consequences of the war. This war arises much moral pain due to the indiscriminate bombing of residential areas, schools, hospitals, and today we mentioned the disaster of Kakhovka, which couldn't be predicted as, for example, disaster in Bangladesh, because it is not predictable at all. And it evokes various negative moral emotions such as anger, shame, guilt, disgust in the military and civilian population. All these emotions arise moral sufferings in Ukrainians, namely blaming oneself, disappointment in authority, loss of religious faith, and trust in others. The mismatch between moral values and real behavior is defined as moral injury, which is the key construct in treating post-traumatic stress disorder. Moral injury is emotional distress from past acts that violate moral values. So the moral pain is derived from the great discrepancy between moral code, how it ought to be, and between the situation which merely is, so the requirements of real situation. And this discrepancy between something ideal, like moral values, and real behavior, which is required by situation in the war, reminds us Ugly Duchess, famous painting by Quentin Metzis, and there is exhibition in National Gallery now, because this Ugly Duchess wants to be very beautiful and very young, but reality shows that it's very ugly and very old. So these real ugly situations during the war are called potentially moral injurious situations, which are ethical dilemmas, in fact, in which moral injury can arise. And there are specific war-related moral injurious situations, and all of them were presented in the narratives of the civilian and military population. For example, political ideas versus experience, when a person says, I was sent to fight a war that no one could win. Or myth of war versus reality of war. For example, the experience of war is the opposite of what were thought to be honorable, true, and virtuous. Or religious belief versus military belief. You cannot love your enemies and do an excellent job of killing them. Or dead versus alive. The problem was not that I died, but that I did not. In the context of Ukraine, some studies connect the moral emotions of shame, guilt, anger, and disgust to the transgenerational transmission of genocidal trauma, namely the Holodomor 1932-1933 and the Holocaust, which occurred in the territory of Soviet Union. And the Holodomor, probably not all people know, now is recognized by 33 countries in the world. The Holodomor is the famine, is genocide which was organized by the Soviet Union. And about 4 million people were killed. And the main objective of the genocide of the Holodomor was to abolish Ukrainian people, Ukrainian ethnicity, Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language. And findings show a predisposition to post-traumatic stress disorder in direct descendants of Holodomor and Holocaust survivors under acute stress, like this war, Russian-Ukraine war. Our study aims to extend the understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder in civilian and military population during the first 3 months of Ukraine. And a total of 350 participants, including the Ukrainian armed forces and students from different universities in Volyn Oblast in the western part of Ukraine, were recruited into the study by the Ukrainian Psychotrauma Center, which I led. And the research was during the first 3 months of the war, March-May 2022. Our findings showed that civilians have a higher prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety than military population. And we interpret the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder and other emotional distress in the civilians in several ways. First, the emotional distress of COVID pandemic was immediately followed by the continuous traumatic stress of the war. So the lockdown in Ukraine was going to be over February, on the 28th of February, but the war started on the 24th of February. So our social isolation didn't erupt, because one social isolation because of COVID was continued by another social isolation caused by war, because many shelters were not ready to accommodate people, and many people started to learn or to work remotely, not started but continued after COVID. Another potential interpretation is that civilians compared to military population experience lower psychological preparedness and this social or unit cohesion for the Russian invasion. Many Ukrainians have tight family connections with Russia, since both countries are post-Soviet states and have established many family and professional ties. And finally, many civilians in Western Ukraine, as I told, are double internally displaced people who, according to recent findings, have a higher prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder compared to not displaced people in the east part of Ukraine. The results of our research indicate that there is no difference in moral injury prevalence in civilians and military population. However, the scores of moral injury, not post-traumatic stress disorder, but precisely of moral injury, reach the clinical threshold in both samples, military and civilian population. So it means that both military and civilian populations in Ukraine have moral injury. A possible explanation for this might be that specific war-related moral dilemmas are most common for both civilians and military populations. Interestingly, that the Merriam-Webster dictionary suggested the word for 2022, because this Merriam-Webster dictionary suggested one concept for each year. But the concept in 2022 was gaslighting. Gaslighting is a psychological manipulation in which the abuser attempts to sow self-doubt and confusion in the victim's mind. This word precisely describes the gaslighting produced by Russia propaganda in terms of George Orwell dichotomies. Invasion is liberation, de-Ukrainization is denationalization, deportation is adaptation, slavery is freedom. The gaslighting in the form of Russian propaganda might be a robust predictor of moral injury in civilian and military population in Ukraine. The second question in our research was whether there were any difference in moral injury and post-traumatic stress disorder and associated mental health symptoms between individuals with and without genocidal trauma. And the results indicate that the group with previous genocidal trauma demonstrates significantly higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. These results also accord with other studies which show that Holocaust and Holodomor survivors' offspring show a higher vulnerability to stress and higher predisposition to post-traumatic stress disorder. So, conclusion. The current study assessed military and civilian samples during the first 3 months of the Ukrainian-Russian war. The study highlighted the increased rate of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety in civilians compared to the military population, and high rates of clinical rates of moral injury in both samples. Additionally, previous genocidal trauma impacts post-traumatic stress symptoms. The findings of this study have several important implications for future practice and indicate that the greater attention should be paid to previous genocidal trauma in treating post-traumatic stress disorder. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Larysa. That was fantastic. Lots of questions which will come up in a minute, I'm sure. But before we do that, we're going to turn to Aisel Omarova. Now, I mentioned children earlier in the British Academy, not just because it's fun to mention them and because my daughter had a baby 3 weeks ago, but because Aisel Omarova is an associate professor at Yaroslav Mudrya National Law University in Ukraine, and she works on the historical and legal aspects of children's rights, which is, again, highly relevant to the return and to the rebuilding of Ukraine. She's a member of the Children's Rights Protection at the national and international level, and a reviewer, member of editorial boards of Access to Justice in Eastern Europe, Problems of Legality, Law and Society, and so forth. And she's currently based at the University of Warwick. So, over to you, Aisel.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you. I mean, British Academy, CARA, all European academies, and other organizations who are somehow involved, that all Ukrainian scientists who are based right now in Ukraine, we are in safe. And as Luke said, first of all, for us I have 2 children, and it was really crucial for me that my children are in safe, firstly, and then my career, of course. That is why we really appreciate this. On behalf of all Ukrainian scientists who are right now in this room and who are not here, I want to say thank you, first of all. And now, as was said, my topic of my research is children's rights. So I want to speak about a very painful topic about deported and forcibly transferred children. So we have an official statistic, let me say about that. So according to the Office Prosecutor General, National Police of Ukraine, National Information Bureau, that are 490 children injured, 1,027, disappeared 560, founded 13,869, deported 19,499, but according to the open sources voiced by the Russian Federation, just listen, 744,000 children are deported and returned just 373. It's an awful statistic of our war. So there are 2 main categories of children which were forcibly transferred and or deported. So first of all, there are orphans, that is children who no longer have parents, either because their parents are dead, or they're unknown, or their parents have legally abandoned their child. Second category of the children is unaccompanied children. That is children who have parent or parents but have been separated from them for various reasons that may be but not need to be related to the current conflict. There are 3 main common indicated grounds for the transfer of children from the territory of Ukraine to the temporary occupied territory like Crimea or to territory of the Russian Federation. So first of all, it is the evacuation for security reasons. So this ground was suggested as the legal form for the large-scale transfers of civilian population, including children, which took place from the territories of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic in the week preceding the Russian Federation's attack on Ukraine of 21st February 2022. From Kherson, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, and Enerhodar, children were transferred or deported to the Rostov and Krasnodar regions, and also to occupied Crimea. Security reasons are also indicated as the most common ground for the transfer from their home areas of children whose parents have been killed in the current conflict, who have lost their parents in the course of the conflict, or whose parents or other legal guardians have been detained during the so-called filtration. Second ground is transfer for the purpose of adoption or foster care. This is especially the case of children from Crimea, which the Russian Federation has considered to be part of the territory since unlawful annexation of the region in 2014, and where the Russian legislation on family matters has been applied since. This legislation makes it possible for citizens from any part of the Russian Federation to adopt orphan children from Crimea. So there are more than 1,000 children have been thus displaced from Crimea to other parts of the Russian Federation, since those children are now considered to have Russian citizenship. Since the unlawful annexation of the 4 Ukrainian regions, that is Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia in October 2022, I'm convinced that everybody knows about that. Orphan children from those regions have been in the same position as children from Crimea. So custody, guardianship, or foster family have been applied for those children. And third ground is temporary stays in the so-called recreation camps. Large number of Ukrainian children have been transferred to the temporary occupied territory, Crimea, or to the territory of the Russian Federation, or even Belarus, for the purpose of temporary stays in the so-called recreation camps. The number of such children might have reached 6,000. The Ukrainian children have been placed at least 43 facilities all across the Russian territory, some as far as Siberia and Eastern Pacific coast. Some of the children have moreover been retained in the camps much longer than originally planned, allegedly due to the security situation in their home region. There are reports of children being moved among various camps without the consent of their parents or legal guardians. A certain variation to the temporary stay in the so-called recreation camps is the transfer of Ukrainian children to the temporary occupied territories or to the Russian Federation, allegedly for medical or rehabilitational purposes. According to the Article 78 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Convention 1949, no party to the conflict shall arrange for the evacuation of children other than its own nationals to a foreign country except for a temporary evacuation where compelling reasons of the health or medical treatment of the children, or except in occupied territory their safety so require. With a view to facilitating the return to their families and country of children evacuated, the authorities of the party arranging for evacuation, and as appropriate the authority who is receiving, shall establish for each child card with photograph, name, sex, date of birth, place of birth, parents' name, nationality, child's nationality, and so on, which they shall send to the Central Tracing Agency of the International Committee of the Red Cross. So these are the main grounds of the forcible transfer and deportation. So if we are talking about, as I said, 373 children were returned to Ukraine, and if we are talking about the returning, so there are no publicly open information how they are returned because of security reasons, but it seems that it is results from a joint operation involving Ukrainian authorities, civil society organizations from Ukraine and or other countries, volunteers from Ukraine and or Russia even, as well as mainly parents as the relatives or other legal guardians of the relevant children. Russia seems to make it difficult for Ukrainian families as well as Ukrainian authority to locate the transferred Ukrainian children by inter alia, not having any list of such children, repeatedly moving children from one area to another. Also, they use Russian form of Ukrainian names of these Ukrainian children in official communication. The reports and statements also suggest that families which are successful in locating their children and seek to return them back to Ukraine encounter numerous obstacles as they have to personally travel to the place where their children are. They need to bring numerous documents. The handing over of the children and the departure of the family is often delayed on various grounds, and actually it's really very expensive. It could reach even $3,000 to return one child. On the Russian side, there is currently no functional mechanism for the repatriation of children to Ukraine or for transport to a third country. And as a lawyer, I want to speak a little bit about legal treatment of these actions from the Russian side. So not every, but some of forceful relocations of children in child institution have been clear violation of international humanitarian law, some of which amount to a violation of the prohibition of forceful transfer or deportation in the First Geneva Convention, Article 49, a grave breach of the Convention and war crime. Secondly, practice of non-consensual separation of family with ensuring transfer of the children to Russia violates the prohibition of the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49, and Article 78, First Additional Protocol to the Geneva Convention, and amounts to breach of the prohibition on deportation in Article 49, Fourth Geneva Convention, a grave breach of the Convention, and a war crime. Thirdly, some of children from Ukraine have been brought to other occupied areas, as I said, for medical treatments or recreation camps without consent of their parents. And prolonged stay imposed by the occupying power is in most cases non-consensual and amounts to a violation of the Article 78, First Additional Protocol to the Geneva Convention, in situations where the children are subsequently taken to Russia or where the treatment of the children is clearly intent on a prolonged stay. This non-consensual displacement may be juxtaposed with deportation under First Geneva Convention, Article 49. Fourthly, as for reunification and repatriation, non-justified prolonged stay or non-justified logistical hurdles violate the international humanitarian law duty to facilitate reunification and contravenes the principle embodied within the First Geneva Convention that family unity is to be protected and respected. Fifth, the exposed unaccompanied children to adoption or similar measures of assimilation is anathema according to the First Geneva Convention. Altering the nationality of Ukrainian children by offering Russian citizenship is a violation of Article 50 of First Geneva Convention. The policy also contravenes the principle embodied within the First Convention that family unity is to be protected and respected. Facilitating adoption by Russian families suggests plans for prolonged stay and may indicate preparation for the grave breach of unjustifiable delay in the repatriation of civilians in Article 85 of the First Additional Protocol to the Geneva Convention. And it also serves to confirm that the displaced Ukrainian children are indeed the victims of deportation in the sense of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And sixth, the last, numerous and overlapping violations of the rights of the children deported to the Russian Federation have taken place. Not only has the Russian Federation manifestly violated the best interests of the children repeatedly, it has also denied their rights to identity, their right to family, their right to unite with their family, as well as violate their right to education, access to information, right to rest, leisure, play, recreation, and participation in cultural life and arts, as well as a right to thought, conscience, religion, right to health, and the right to liberty and security. These are ongoing violations of Articles 3, 8, 9, 10, 12, 14, 17, 20, 21, 24, 28, 29, 31, and 37 of the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child. The cumulative effects of these multiple violations also give rise to very serious concern that the rights of these children to be free from torture and ill treatment and other inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment have been violated under the Article 37 of the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child. Thus, if we are making conclusion, so forcible transfer and or deportation of Ukrainian children to the temporary occupied territory and to the territory of the Russian Federation may amount to a crime against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer of population. And if we are talking about qualifying, so these actions of Russian Federation, if we qualify it as a war crime, it's 8 to 12 years of imprisonment are provided for deportation and displacement. If deportation is considered as element of genocide, imprisonment from 10 to 15 years and life imprisonment are provided. I can talk a lot about that, but we have fixed time. So this is why I will stop in that. Thank you a lot for your attention.
Thank you. Well, there's some horrific figures there, and there's an obvious connection between the two papers in the sense that it would be very, very surprising if there wasn't a great deal of psychological trauma involved in your cases as well. So in order to start some discussion, perhaps we could start with Larysa and go back to your paper, and you talk about moral injury. We have plenty of scientists here who will see injury as something that should be cured. Curing moral injury is not straightforward.
Could you comment?
Would you care to comment on that? How does one go about curing moral injury?
Yeah, so moral injury is a good point, Simon. Moral injury is a relatively new concept, but as a member of Trinity College, I found a very beautiful book, Method of Ethics by Henry Sidgwick. He's very famous philosopher of morality, and his book, it's 1994, as I'm not mistaken. He told about moral pain, and he's told that he's the founder of utilitarianism in philosophy, who knows probably, and he told that it's impossible to make decision in ethical dilemmas which is absolute good or absolute harm. We have to find some decision which makes good more people and makes less harm people. So that's why we have, so there is no absolute good. It's for moral injury. So if to speak about, because now for many scholars it's very great question what to do with moral injury, because it's very large comorbidity for post-traumatic stress disorder, and we have a lot of evidence-based protocols, not many, but we have still cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, so they are evidence-based for treating post-traumatic stress disorder. But the people who are treated with these protocols, they still have moral injury. So moral injury is not treated in classical way when we treat post-traumatic stress disorder. But now scholars make some ideas that we cannot talk about treating moral injury because it's not mental disorder which is classified in DSM or international classification of disorders. So that's why it's probably more appropriate to say about intervention for moral injury. And as I coordinated national project in Ukraine on moral injury, my idea that just working with this or reflection on moral dilemmas which are typical during war, typical for war-related moral dilemmas, is very good way to work with moral injury. So it's not about curing moral injury, it's about very good intervention to prevent and, if possible, to work with moral injury.
Now, I've read a good deal on the psychological trauma of the Holocaust, both its cause and its effects. And one of the most striking things in that, of course, is an exaggerated sense of the other in terms of the bestialization, animalization of the Jews before the event, and then afterwards the intense horror of Germany and Germans amongst the Jewish survivors who survived. Can you say a little bit more about how complicated it must be between Ukraine and Russia when for many years, as you've said already, there are intense connections, often families who are connected in the same way, with many people living in Russia who are Ukrainians and Russians living in Ukraine, speaking a similar language. One thinks of the imagination of Odessa to Russians. For Russians, Odessa is home. For many of them, it's the place they go on holiday or whatever. It's part of that. So how is it going to work for you in terms of thinking about PTSD and the models we have of PTSD when the self and the other are so differently constructed from the models we usually deal with?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, we had very good round table in British Academy, and I was participant. And then it was discussion about national identity and civilian identity. And representatives of British Academy told that Ukraine is a unique place, and we should be proud that civilian identity or civic identity is highly developed in Ukraine. But Probably in this stage, and because civic identity is fundamental, foundations for democracy. But at this stage, probably at this stage of development, of our development as Ukrainians, and if to overcome this injustice, epistemic injustice, because many people just till to this war look at Ukraine as some part of Russia, some part of Russian Empire. And this war is a very good chance for Ukrainians to say a word that we are not Russian Empire. We are Ukrainians. We have very, very large history from Kiev Rus. I'm not historian, I'm not political psychology. I'm sorry, I'm clinical psychology, but you know, I have to be. And from this case, probably it makes sense to talk about national identity. And for Ukraine, it's a very good chance just during this war, after this war, to develop not civic, but national identity. And I think it will be very good tool for mental health system, because national identity is very strong predictor, a very robust predictor of national security. Not civic identity is predictor of national security, but national identity. And I think if Ukrainians will take this opportunity, this possibility to develop national identity, like Israeli society, as a part of national security, I think we overcome post-traumatic stress disorder, moral injury, and all associated symptoms.
This is a really interesting coincidence that I'm teaching in my home university legal history of Ukraine and legal history of foreign countries. That is why I can contribute a little bit to Larysa's speech. As for perestroika period, Larysa mentioned that about nobody expected that USSR will collapse from inside, but there are some like rumors that Gorbachev was sent there to collapse, first of all, USSR. It's my first comment. And second comment, as for that Ukraine is not a part of Russia, in 1990, when USSR still existed, Supreme Council of USSR adopted the law and according to which if a country, a Soviet republic, wants to be independent, has to pass some special steps, and it will take something like from 5 to 10 years. It was really very hard to do it. And even there was one deputy parliamentary from Ukraine. She said that it's law how to not be independent. So, and that is why, when all Soviet republics they declared their independence, Russia said that it's not like that. Your independence is not legal. You didn't do it under the law of USSR. That is why Russia still thinks that some of politicians think that Ukraine, Belarus, and other post-Soviet countries are still like one country and Russia's territory. Thank you.
So if national security and national identity go strongly together and history is important, the obvious problem with that is the sort of history that gets written. Mm-hmm. The history that gets written is often a history that is over-exaggerated, over-committed. I can say this hand on heart that I have seen textbooks in Israel which I would not recommend. Right? So consequently, and I say that as a firm friend of Israel, so do you think it's possible to influence the imaginary, of a people, to help them think about this national identity without producing the sorts of commitments that lead to the sorts of violence that we're now seeing? After all, it's a commitment to a sense of national identity at some level that is motivating the Russians.
Right, I think that
It's an unfair question to ask you, I know, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
probably one sentence, one only sentence about it. My
perhaps-
reflection that
perhaps I
nobody
can comment on
probably.
what she thinks about it.
It's funny, but nobody did so much for developing national identity as Putin, because he did his best in order just to separate forever, right?
Exactly.
Just for this stage,
Yeah.
at this period of and it's a very good question, Simon, because a comment, because today we were talking, I think during the first panel, it was very good question about education, because
Yeah.
research is very fine, and research should be the basis for education, not education, then research, and then it could be implemented in education. And that's why it's very important to have very strong research on national identity in part, and then to implement it in education.
I might say the
In
real,
very good books.
The
Yes.
real strength of education and of national identity is when it can deal with real education about its own past.
Yeah.
Right. But sorry, you want to come and look?
No, I was just going to say that Ireland has some experience with difficult histories and conflicts, and these issues resonate. I mean, not at the same level, obviously,
Yeah.
but and also the linguistic question. I mean, there was certainly a campaign while Britain occupied Ireland to actually suppress the Irish language. And part of the independence movement was an attempt to revive the Irish language, which partially succeeded, partially didn't. So I think it is important to say that this is not just a war on infrastructure or war on people, it's a war on culture and identity. And certainly talking to Ukrainian colleagues early on in the conflict, one of the things which really annoyed them was that in many Western universities, the only experts on Ukraine were based in what was called the Department of Russian. Now, I think we could agree that perhaps we should rename these as Slavonic Studies Institutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it certainly was an issue. And language is important in this. I mean, my Ukrainian colleagues get very annoyed when we talk about the Ukrainian war or the conflict in Ukraine. They say it's not our conflict. This was imposed on us externally. I prefer to say the war on Ukraine rather than the war in Ukraine. So we need to be careful how we speak about these things.
Yeah.
Want to comment on that?
No.
Well, perhaps just a simple question, first of all. The age of the children you were talking about, can you say a little more about that? Because I wasn't quite sure whether you were talking about babies or adolescents.
Actually,
or
it's
both.
about all children under the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child, like all people until age of 18, they are supposed to be children, and all these statistics is, and actually according to the Ukrainian legislation, family code, it's 18 years. So mostly deported and forcibly transferred. All, like, not, for example, 5 years old children. No, all years of children are forcibly transferred or deported. It could be 14 years old girls, even 17 years old boys. By the way, for example, if we are talking about boys, some of them were 17 when they were deported, and then they turned 18 in the Russian territory, and then they sent them to the war. Yeah, they sent our Ukrainian children to the war, to their country. If you want, if there is if there is a need, I can explain the difference between forcible transferred and deported children, because it's not the same definitions.
Could you give some sense of the breakdown of those figures? I mean, are this equal across all ages of children, or is it mainly 17-year-olds?
There is no statistic about that, because because as I said before, Russia doesn't have any list. All we have. I said about the statistic official, all we have about deported children is when parents or other legal guardians say that our child was deported or forcibly transferred. Yeah, so.
Yes. And
yeah, about So I want to be more like lawyer. So there was International Tribunal for the Prosecution of Persons responsible for serious violation of international humanitarian law committed in the territory of former Yugoslavia since 1991. This was in 2001. And according to the paragraph 521, deportation and forcible transfer relate to the involuntary and unlawful evacuation of individuals from the territory in which they are reside. So deportation presumes transfer beyond state borders, whereas forcible transfer when it is within the, like displacement within the state. So that is why we are some children just forcibly transferred to the occupied territories, for example, occupied Crimea. Some of them, firstly, they were transferred and then they were deported.
Right, thank you. And do you have any sense of what the possibilities of reparation is? What you've given us is a picture of really quite horrific proportions and absolutely horrific cases. The idea that you'll be sent to fight against your own people in that way is really, really bad. And many others examples you've given. But what sort of reparation? I'm thinking back to the question of PSTD, but actually there's both legal, social, and psychological reparation.
Are you asking reparation in sense of in financial sense?
No, well, I hope not. No, I certainly hope your answer won't be in financial sense, But no, I meant in terms of socially, what can you do towards rebuilding? Legally, what can you do? And psychologically, I suppose it'd be interesting to know whether you thought this was a particular case that you will be able to deal with through moral injury.
So, first of all, there are there were a lot of news that some activities, like some monies or some property of high-level Russian policymakers were like, how to say it, like were stopped of using of their using, and in future they will be sold and money will be given to Ukraine for rebuilding. If we are talking about money, if we are talking about children, this is a problem that some children we can't identify where they are, where are their placed. So some of them were found and returned to Ukraine, and they really need some re-education because they were they are in some Russian schools, in Russian nurseries, kindergartens, and other institutions where they. Can you imagine? There are evidence that they listen Russian hymn several hours. And they don't allow them to speak Ukrainian language. And so that is why these kids need re-education and big psychological support, because some of them were abused psychologically, physically, sexually. So that is why psychological, it's also, they need also psychological support.
Yeah, well, the temporality of all of this, the time of all of this is really, in both cases, and how long it will take for that reparation is an extraordinary thought.
It will be too long, really. What is the problem? The problem is that children are our future, not just in Ukraine, but in every country, for example, in UK. And that is why they take from us our future. And that is why, for example, for now, war is 1 year and 4 months. And every month, it's plus 1, maybe even 2 years of returning, mentally returning these kids every 1 month. That is why we should, I think that all international community should help us with returning these children, make some sanctions to, about this decision of International Criminal Court. But the problem is that Russia signed this document, Rome Statute, but in 2001, I think. But then in 2016, but they signed, but not declared. And in 2016, Putin adopted a decree in which he wrote that Russia won't make it a part of their legislation because of the Crimea. because they occupied Crimea in 2014. So that is why it's a big problem to return these children and to apply for Russia, for example, these articles under the Rome Statute.
Could you please comment from psychological perspective? Of course, we have no research yet on psychological consequences for these children, but we could imagine these consequences. We have only a very detailed report of a Yale public health school, and there are a lot of details actually of this forced adaptation in part, and there are some debates among clinical psychologists that some of them say that probably it's too traumatic for these children to come back to Ukraine because they have adjusted to Russian, and then it was like a trauma again to bring them back to Ukraine. But of course, position of Ukrainian clinical psychologists, we have to bring these children back, and there are some reports, not from these children, but from mothers of these children, and these mothers, when they retold these stories, they are very happy to have these children back, and these mothers say that children also are very happy to come back to Ukraine. I think this topic will be studied a lot about forced adoption in future, and we could know many details about it. But now it's terrific, a terrible moment and terrible episode of this war. And as about language of war, we tell that it's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So we have some proper term for war.
Can I comment on this? The thing is that some children who were deported to the Russian Federation territory, they were from Russian-speaking territories of Ukraine. Some cities are were Russian-speaking before the war, of course, and the problem not just in language, because they used to this language to speak in school, not in school, but in family, in like speaking Russian, and it wasn't a problem for them. The problem is that they every day there's an evidence of some returned children that they heard every day from their like foster families that. Listen, it's this news from Ukraine. Nazi, it's Nazi. And you are from there, but now we save you, and now you're in a safe place, and they're Nazi. And they heard it every day. So this is a problem, not just language, but generally this pressure that they had, and some of them had, and some of them have right now in Russian Federation.
And is there any work being done on the many citizens in Ukraine who did not speak Ukrainian, but spoke only Russian? Was that socially difficult?
I could say about our university, when a lot of internally displaced people came to Volyn Oblast, it's in border with Poland. Our university suggested some training for Ukrainian language. And I was surprised because when I came for the first time to this class just to look at it, I was surprised that so many people were present. And nobody forced them to come. They just came because they decided to live in the western part. They liked our city very much. We have a very beautiful city. It's called Lutsk. And yes, and they came to learn Ukrainian language because they decided it's their own decision. It's not forced decision. So it's,
3 questions in Slido.
There are. Okay. I've got 3 questions here, which I will ask. This is one from Alexandra Berezko. It says, what is the best way to help Ukrainian academia to recover and develop, in your opinion?
It's for you, I think, or for us?
Well, I mean, I sort of answered it. I mean,
yes.
I think the important thing is to keep the career structure alive and make sure that we don't lose an entire generation of early career researchers. Now, that's easier said than done, but from my perspective, I mean, as I said earlier, it's very important to listen to Ukrainian voices, and I think this really should be answered by one of our two Ukrainians here. So.
If you don't mind,
Yeah.
can I answer
Yes,
this question?
please do.
As a person who has this experience to be in to work in Ukrainian university and to be hosted in UK university, I can say that we learned actually a lot from our UK colleagues, and all of us. I'm deeply convinced that when we return to Ukraine, we will bring all our knowledge. It's not just about knowledge some knowledge, for example, about some subject. No, I mean knowledge about collaboration, about communication, about I'm saying knowledge in more broad meaning, that we can bring this knowledge. We definitely will bring this knowledge to Ukraine, and it will support our Ukrainian academy alive, I think.
And I'd like to say that being here in UK, we are very grateful to British Academy, to Kara, and I'd like to emphasize that Ukrainian scholars, probably not only Ukrainian, but I'm Ukrainian scholar, we could be not only consumers, we could be suppliers of good academic product. That's why I think it's a very good point when we signed document, terms and conditions, which was suggested by British Academy before we came here. It was some requirement for host universities to disseminate results of our research in society, in practice. And I think it's a very good point, because if you involve us in your society, if our results of our research will be good for society, for persons, so I think it's a great deal. And that's why I think it's very good assistance. For example, University of Cambridge is involving us a lot, and it's a very strong point to be involved very actively in research.
Good.
If I could just add one point. I mean, I think also the reform of the funding system and the administrative structures in Ukraine is important. I mean, clearly, and as I think we all hope and believe the future of Ukraine is in closer association with Europe, then the organizational structures within Ukraine have to be aligned with the European research area structures. And that is also going to happen, I think. I've been quite impressed with the National Research Funding Agency in Ukraine. I mean, they are clearly committed to modernization and renewal. So.
Thank you. We're going to open the discussion to the room at this point, so I hope there will be questions from the audience. And I can see 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, so I'll take some of these before we go back to the absolute, whatever it's called. Please. If you'd say would you mind saying who you are before you ask the question? Very good. It's on. I can see it's on.
I'm Tarmo Soomere, President of Estonian Academy of Sciences and also Chair of European Science Advisors Forum, which is a network of chief science advisors of European countries. So I'm really happy that this discussion happened today. In this sense, it reflects the position of Antonio, presented in the opening words, that Max Weber's understanding of independence of science and science academies should possibly be rethought. I understand that this position is in zone of being comfortable and saying that science is always apolitical. The end of history hasn't achieved. Francis Fukuyama wasn't correct. And we are in the situation when the understanding of Europe as a stronghold of democracy, peace, and prosperity is totally eroded, or actually it's wiped off. We are the place for the bloodiest war in the entire world, and now second century in a row. So this presents actually massive questions and massive challenges to the academies. I think that in this time of polarization and explicit war, academies cannot be apolitical anymore, and science cannot be apolitical anymore. Whatever we do or whatever we don't will be assigned a political dimension. This is clear starting from 24th of February last year. This also presents challenges about what the academies actually should do or what they can do. If you look into statutes of most of European and international and academies in the rest of the world, you see the double calling there. It is not only driving and representing science, it's supporting your country in all possible aspects which are needed. So this is now time when we have to rethink what does it mean to support your country in all necessary aspects. In this polarized world with a bloody war, it is necessary to abandon the understanding that we advise our countries only in social and economical issues. Most probably, and it's my deep belief, we should support our countries also in military and foreign policy aspects, in the question of life and death. Like Larysa was saying, that sometimes it's more painful to remain alive than to die. And this has also major implications to science advice, which is one of the priorities of ALEA. Science advice cannot stay apart from those changes. So again, reinforcing my point, we have to include military and science and foreign policy issues into standard science advice. We can't stay apolitical anymore. Thank you.
I'm not sure that was a question. It certainly raises a question of considerable importance for everybody who's involved in policy in the academy. The degree to which one gets involved and where one gets involved is extremely important. I happen to agree with you that it is impossible to be apolitical in such matters, and I think sometimes the belief that we can simply present data to government and government will move on with it is a naivety, actually. But where you go forward from that is a politically extremely difficult case, which I'm sure all the academies are struggling with. Please, can I take the one at the back there, please, first? Second. Yes, please. The lady on the corner. Yes, thank you. Sorry, the lights, I can't see who you are.
Thank you.
Name. I'm sorry.
This is also more, maybe just a thank you and a comment. Thank you so much for this presentation. In the Royal Danish Academy, I think also that this situation, we feel that it has given us a new opportunity to become relevant in a new way as academies. Because first of all, we feel that the colleagues who are displaced from Ukraine, who come as scholars to Denmark, they seek the academy. And the academy can play a role as national platforms that our universities cannot in the same way play. And the second part is, I think that in our academy we have many senior members, and they have acted as mentors and networks for. And again, this is in a way it's been a resource to see that we have very experienced and top researchers who have time and who want to share their networks with the younger scholars who come. So again, I think our academies can do something that universities cannot, and we should really celebrate and use this.
Thank you. Front row, please. Thanks.
Yeah, Francis Crawley. Yeah, I'm also with the Ukraine Clinical Research Support Initiative. We have a meeting next week on the 29th with the State Expert Center at the Ministry of Health, which is their FDA, if you want. What we saw, I think, with clinical research, just to speak about one scientific area there, was the enormous importance that clinical research has in Ukraine. And it's not just clinical research, but it's science generally. Science plays a fundamental role in society, in education, in understanding disease and treating disease, in healthcare generally. We would not have in Belgium or you in the UK the kinds of hospitals that we have if we didn't have clinical research going on. We wouldn't have that standard of healthcare. And in Ukraine, it was particularly important because of the condition of the healthcare system, even before the war. So probably anybody in Ukraine who was receiving treatment for cancer, or most people receiving treatment for cancer, would have been in a clinical study one way or the other in order to get the treatment itself. So clinical research plays an enormous importance there. And by looking at that and understanding that there, and also understanding the diaspora that comes with a situation like this, with patients and their families and so forth, becomes extremely complicated. So I hope Alia will help us participate in this. It's not just a European group, it's also working with SIOMS and WHO and things like that. I think it's very important. I thought the panel was excellent. I really think it's fantastic that you present your research and you discuss it with us. It's really important. By chance, last night when I was flying from Brussels to London, I sat next to 2 Syrian refugees, one of whom is a data scientist. And of course, colleagues in Sudan now, colleagues in Ethiopia, Libya, all over the place who have experienced the same kinds of situations that you're experiencing. I was wondering, what would the panel's advice be for researchers, because that's the topic for our conversation here. What would be the panel's advice to researchers and what they see the role of research as within a conflict situation? Because I see, like with the work with UNESCO, it's easy to talk about earthquakes. It's easy to talk about a pandemic or something. We're equipped to talk about that. But as we can see in the discussion here, it's very difficult to talk about conflict situations because they bring in a whole sphere, not just of science or even just politics, but feelings and how we comport ourselves to one another. So how would you suggest, from your experience, what roles should science play inside of a conflict situation? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for the question. Actually, it's really very important, I think, because sometimes not everybody understands what is like importance of the research in this kind of critical situations. So from my point of view, it's, for example, if we are talking about like my topic of research, we have a voice to talk about that and to make like an attention on this, and after that, when we talk about it on publicly, and everybody hears about that, and then there starts some discussions on the high-level policymakers, not just within some researchers or some academies, which is also very important actually. But it's, as in my understanding, it's like a first stage, and the next stage is a discussion between high-level policymakers. And as I said before, we have this result, for example, with International Criminal Court, but it's not the end. It's just a first point. It's just a start of this. For example, if we are talking about deportation, it's the first point from which we can start. We should do our research, talk about that, and then we can achieve some goals as for war. Definitely, everybody knows that war will end at some point, and I definitely know that Ukraine will win. But the question is, as a lawyer, I'm saying, the question is how it will end. It could be frozen conflict, which is the most awful scenario, or it could be solved with signing some document between, for example, as I can see it, between 3 parties like Ukraine, Russian Federation, and, for example, on the third party, it could be, for example, United Kingdom, USA, maybe France. I don't know, something like that, somebody from from side. And the thing is, what will be written in this document, and what will be written there will come. I'm deeply convinced that it will come from the research. Thank you.
Probably I could comment because 2 days ago it was amazing workshop at University of Cambridge about lived experience and co-production. And we were introduced with James Lind Alliance, and this alliance gives 10 priorities for research according to each disorder, mental disorder, and according to each disease. And as to translate it to Ukraine, it's very important because, for example, there is no post-traumatic stress disorder in this list, but there is veterans' health, and it's actually started to to examine these 10 priorities in veterans' health in 2022. The results, the data is processing now. But, for example, for such mental disorders as depression, as anxiety, when I looked these 10 priorities for researchers, they do not coincide with Ukrainian context during the war. And for me, as clinical psychologist, now the task number one is try to retranslate these 10 priorities for each mental disorder, which is published as a priority setting partnership, and just to translate it in Ukraine, considering the consequences of the war. So my first step is contact the Ministry of Veterans Affairs in Ukraine and to inform them about this priority list and try and ask UK scholars to help us to translate it. Just according to research. We are not talking about treatment, it's about research which could be basis for further treatment, PTSD or some interventions. So I see sense in it.
I might add one comment, if I may, and that's war is between Ukraine and Russia at the moment, but it has international impact across the world. And one of the most obvious ways is in terms of food security. And I think it's been remarkable the number of very high-level agricultural scientists that the British Academy has been able to bring out. And I think one of the most important things is to be able to articulate clearly, both to policymakers, but also to a general public, the consequences and understanding of war, why this is being fought and what the consequences are. And the consequences for food security across the world are really severe from what's happening, and not just from the war, but from the dam and from other aspects that are going on. So I think there's a real way of changing the imaginary of the population so that people around the world understand the consequences of war, not merely as the suffering of individuals over there, but consequences for us here. And I think that has an influence then on policy and on the politics of how we might react. So I think that research can also be crucial. But I'll take, there's a question at the back there, towards the back. Yes, please. Yes, you. I can't see who it is from here. The light is terrible.
Mark Warport.
Oh, it's Mark. Hi, Mark. Sorry.
I just want to make the point that actually the 20th century system of support for science evolved sadly from warfare. So warfare has always been an incredibly important stimulus for research. Much health research, blood transfusions, orthopedic surgery, trauma surgery has come out of the study of war, vitamin research, and frankly, the National Science Foundation in the United States was a product of the Second World War, and the UK system of research councils came from Viscount Haldane's report from the Ministry of Reconstruction at the end of the First World War. So it is a sad fact of life that it is a very, very powerful stimulus for research, and some of the greatest scientists, so Lawrence Bragg, who won the Nobel Prize, won the Military Cross in France in the First World War for working on sand ranging. But I think your point, Simon, just now, that resilience, which we've talked about earlier, has been illustrated by the terrible things that are happening in Ukraine, which is really important lessons in economic geography. Yes. So not only is the research which comes out of the terrible trauma that's going on in Ukraine, but it does have very general application.
Thank you very much. There's a question there, please. Yes. Thank you.
As we talk here, there's actually another conference taking place in London, and it's a conference of rebuilding Ukraine. Allies are pledging billions for recovering Ukraine. And I have a suggestion to everybody is that when you go home to your national academies, and you're going to tell your local governments to have special scientific funds and special scientific calls or funding for specific, solving specific problems connected to rebuilding Ukraine. I think science, you do great work receiving Ukrainian refugees, but I think researchers can do more than that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have an interesting question here online it's from Alea GA, so I'm not quite sure who Alea GA is. But it says, how can we take the lessons of the solidarity and support offered to the Ukrainian researchers and victims of war to build mechanisms to support non-European researchers and victims of war, including those impacted by European foreign policy, such as Middle Eastern and Central African academics? It's an extremely good question that follows on precisely from that last comment on the floor. I don't know whether anybody would like to comment on that, but I can say from empirical experience that raising money for Ukrainian academics at risk was surprisingly easy after the failing attempts to raise money for Syrian academics at risk, where we've been notably short. So I don't know whether any member of any academy would like to comment on that.
Can I ask a question? As I know, you also hosted researchers from Afghanistan, isn't it?
Yes, we have some from Afghanistan.
Yeah, and how was the funding with that?
I'm not sure it was anything like as successful as Ukraine.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I mean, I think one has to say that it was a shameful episode that we didn't do more for Syria and Afghanistan. But of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do what we're doing for Ukraine. We should have done it for others as well.
Yes.
Yeah. I think one lesson to be learned is that, this sadly will not be the last crisis. We need to have structures in place which can be rapidly scaled up.
Yes.
One lesson I think we learned was that we had structures, but they couldn't be scaled up rapidly, and they were set up to address the wrong problem. I mean, they were mainly working at getting visas. That wasn't an issue in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Visas weren't an issue. It was getting money and positions. And so we need to have structures that are universal and can be rapidly scaled up in crisis situations. Now, that's a political aspiration. It will be difficult, but surely we can learn from our experience.
Let us hope. There's a question in the second row here, please, if we may. Sorry.
Should I press something? It's okay?
Next time.
Okay. Sorry for such a non-scientific question in scientific society, but my question concerns beliefs. Question is, especially my Russian-speaking colleagues who can monitor Russian social media and get information directly from ordinary Russians. Question is, do you believe that democratization of Russia is possible? Because we cannot answer this question scientifically. For 400 years of Russian history, they had no record of democratic regimes lasted more than 8 years. There were a couple of cases, but it ended up with a terrible dictatorship. And transition from Yeltsin to Putin is just a recent case. So, again, do you believe that democratization of Russia is possible, and therefore turning Russia in something less aggressive? That's a question.
Can I ask an answer? I will answer to this question because, as I said, I'm a legal historian, so that is why it's somehow related to my teaching. So I think that historically, as you said, there are always these totalitarian regimes or dictatorship, and I believe. By the way, in 2000, it was in 2000, I think, 16. I read some USA politician, like his researcher. He said that Russia will collapse in 2020. And I thought, okay, there's 4 years, we can wait. Actually, I'll be alive, I hope. but there was 2020 and nothing collapsed. So, and I think that actually this war is the start of their collapsing, actually. And if you know, within Russia, there are a lot of non-Russian territories. For example, Dagestan, Chechnya, and other territories. And I think that as a legal historian, I can say that there was Russian Empire, there were a lot of territories, non-Russian territories, non-Russian nationalities. Actually, there are no Russians, I mean, as nationality, to be honest. And I'm saying it not because I'm Ukrainian, I'm saying it's like a legal historian, by the way. So, and the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, and they then gathered again in form of USSR. Then it collapsed in 1991, and then it was just Russia gathered in other form, Russia, and they made this SND, this like you have there is a European Union, the same union but post-Soviet countries. They made it, and within the Russian Federation, official territory, Russian Federation, there are a lot of, as I said, non-Russian territories, and I think that after this war it will collapse. And then it will gather again in some other form. But as for democratization, I think it will take maybe 50 or maybe 100 years for them to be democratic, because it is in their head. It's not about just one person, Putin. It's not about him. It's not about him and, let's say, 10 people who his inner circle. No, it's not about them. It's all about people. So that is why I think it's when we were talking about Ukrainian children re-education, is that it will take years to re-educate them. The same with Russian people. It will take a long time to, let's say, re-educate them to the democratic regime. Maybe you are not, you don't agree with me, but
Completely agree with you. I just, while staying in Stockholm, I have noticed that many people still believe that there is a way to deal with Russia, and finally,
believe me, no.
see that gradually evolving into democratic state. But actually, the only periods when they were democracies were periods when they were separated on the pieces. It sounds very frightening to me because it slides end of the war to a very, very, very distant future.
Well, I'm sure many people here know the wonderful work of Svetlana Alexievich, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, whose book on nostalgia for the Soviet Union is a really extraordinary read. It doesn't give you much optimism in the direction you're pointing. Please. Question.
I suppose that I could have already forgotten the question. But maybe it would be this question, like with a very quick comment. Here, Ukrainians who managed to come to this room and to this country overall, they are privileged to be free of speaking the language that could give them the tool to get out of the country and to proceed their research in safer places. One of the very quick comments regarding how Ukrainian Academy could be assisted or helped, more accessibility and more inclusion of those academics that unfortunately, because it has been, our universities have been evolving in the post-Soviet Union time, oriented on a totally different sphere, like they cannot speak any other language than Russian and probably Ukrainian. I come from the eastern part of Ukraine. That is maybe to create the conditions for accessibility to the research, to high-level research that is currently conducted and has been conducted in Ukraine by Ukrainian scholars, but limited to disseminating this knowledge because they don't have this language tool. And this comes to the question, have you been interested into the research, maybe closer to the social sciences, that has been conducted in Ukraine prior to the war? That is the question. Yeah. So maybe more to the British colleagues.
Yeah, it's for you.
Yeah.
It's for me.
Yeah.
But
I'm asking you.
I think it's for Luke.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I did make the point that a functioning social science research system will be enormously valuable in the reconstruction phase for assessing the impact of programs and making sure they're evidence-based. You raise a very interesting point, actually, which is bibliodiversity in open access publishing, which is a problem that has not been solved. Clearly, there is a lot of very valuable research, particularly in the sort of historical record, which nowadays is largely inaccessible because it's in minority languages and not in the lingua franca of science, which now, for better or for worse, is English. I do wonder whether one of the few positive side effects of artificial intelligence might not be that we can actually automatically do very good translations of these texts into a language that people understand. It should be easily possible nowadays to have a scientific publication and you can click to have it in English or Russian or Ukrainian or French or German or Catalan if you want, or Irish.
Why not?
Why not? This is possible. We just need the will to do it. And technically it's possible. The problems, as always, are structural and political and people, actually. People are the big problem in all this.
Yes, we should get rid of them. There was a conscious policy, and it may not be the right policy, but it was a reflective policy. And that was in respect of some history. So many people here will be familiar with some very great German scientists who came out in the 30s to this country. But we always focus on the very, very great German scientists who came out. And there are a large number of people who were brought in as refugees who found it very hard to get a job, who were much more difficult to integrate into a system, and whom the universities, frankly, did not treat with the respect they might deserve. One of the things we insisted on in the Academy on this committee, that everybody we brought out was coming out to come into a job, to come into a place where they could work with respect and properly advance their career. And to do that, that meant that we had to have a minimum requirement of some English. And that, of course, did exclude a few people. But as Luke said, English is the lingua franca, for better or worse. One could call it the imperial language of science. And we didn't have too many people who were barred from that. But for us, the most important thing was that the people came in would be embedded into a university society and would be able to work properly. And that, I think, has been a success. I hope it's a success. Now, of course, we've chosen our examples very carefully, but we think it's been a fantastic success.
If I could add a comment. I mean, our Danish colleague made a good point earlier that one of the things academies can do is offering a mentoring scheme. We did this in the Irish Academy. In the end, we mentored 5 Ukrainian academics. And one of the big things they wanted actually was help with language, with writing proposals, with writing articles, and certainly help with, well, let's call it academic English, is one of the things that we can offer and should offer.
And certainly at the British Academy, we have at the moment a very large programme of writing workshops in local countries, particularly in Africa and India, attempting to bring scholars up to the scholarly level in that work, where we send people out to do that. So it's very much part of the British Academy's agenda, so we do that. We are reaching the witching hour. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Luke very much for his introduction to Lea's work and to the European Academies, and above all to thank our speakers. It's in the face of what you might call at best the trivial public discourse about migration, immigration and care for the other. It is so nice to be in a room where we can celebrate something that looks like a genuine hospitality and a care for people who are in need against the demands of being other than that. So thank you all for your contributions and thank our speakers very much.
Thank you.